We live in a 24-hour-a-day media landscape that in every hour produces 30,000 hours of video content for YouTube. We send 70 million messages on WhatsApp and spend 9 billion hours a day swiping on our social media. A majority of the content is derivative of somebody else's post or work. It's a remix or a remake of anything and everything. It's all reflective, and it's all copyrighted. Not that those copyrights are being enforced, but it's still mind-boggling how out of date our copyright system is. Cory Doctorow is no stranger to these facts. He's one of the earliest adopters of the Creative Commons license for his works. He, in his science fiction novels, plays with this emergent era of creator-citizen. Today on the show, Cory gives us some deep insight into this issue and how the ownership of works and ideas is bound to change in the future. But before we get started, click on the like button below, do subscribe, and click on the alert button so you can get notified anytime we post new content. Okay, on with the show.
Burning desire. Big ideas. Bold action.
I'm really happy to introduce our guest this week, Cory Doctorow. He's an award-winning speculative science fiction writer, and I say speculative, and we'll get into that in the future of this podcast. He's a blogger and a journalist. He's also an innovator in using Creative Commons licensing and the internet for unprecedented access to his work. Cory, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Let's start off with this Creative Commons thing, since I put it in the introduction. You've published a number of your works there. There's a number of your works, or published a number of your works that have Creative Commons licensing. You've allowed people to download books in ebook form for many years. Tell us a little bit about that. How did you get onto that? And I'm really curious, just for a little bit of a insight and critique into some of the problems with intellectual property as it is today.
Well, yeah, obviously that's a very big subject. I am okay with there being a set of rules to regulate an industry. And to the extent that I'm like part of a supply chain in a multi-billion-dollar entertainment industry, I want there to be some rules, right? What can be contracted for, what count, how contractual disputes are resolved, all of that part, how you allocate like different parts of the supply chain, distributors, investors, creators, and so on. All that stuff is really important to me. And so, I'm okay with there being copyright. That's fine. It's not, like the actual rules that we have aren't great, but the idea that we would have rules is fine with me. The problem is that those rules that regulate the supply chain of my multi-billion-dollar entertainment industry are not well suited to regulating my interactions with my audience. And, whenever we talk about regulation, we tend to focus on what the rules say. And really, the most important thing about regulations, even more than what they say, is who they apply to. So, for example, like I'd be really happy if there were some good finance regulations, right? But it didn't matter. It wouldn't matter like how great those finance regulations were. I wouldn't want them to apply to like Wednesday mornings when I give my daughter her $5 allowance, right? Like I'm not a bank then, right? We're not doing something financy. We're just like doing something personal. And so we need a test, right? Like, are you a bank or aren't you a bank? And we might say, oh, well, if, $1 million changes hands, it doesn't matter how, like what kind of institution you are, we're still going to treat you like a bank. We're going to ask you to do some financial paperwork. That's great, right? Now, say we have hyperinflation tomorrow, which I don't think we're going to have. I think people who worry about hyperinflation are idiots who don't understand how money works. But say we had hyperinflation tomorrow and like a sandwich cost $1 million. If I took you out for a sandwich, it wouldn't make me a bank, right? If I took you out for a sandwich and spent $1 million, we change the rule for who's a bank so that we wouldn't make people understand finance regulations to buy sandwiches. Now, the internet has created inflation in the test that we use for whether you're part of the entertainment industry. And the thing we used to use as the test, we still use as the test for whether you're in the entertainment industry, is whether you're making or handling a copy of a creative work. And that was a pretty good proxy for a long time. Every book had a printing press in its history. Every record had a record factory in its history. You couldn't make a film copy without a lab and a factory. And so, yeah, of course, that's there's some people at the margins you'd catch who weren't in the entertainment industry. But as a set of rules, as a first approximation, it's fine. Maybe sometimes you have to go to court to figure out who is and isn't, at the margin. But like most of the people captured by the regulation are actually in the industry. Well, the internet works by making copies, right? That's how computers work. Like when you stream a video, you are in fact downloading a video. The idea that there's like a stream and a download, it's kind of a consensus hallucination. Like unless the internet were composed of like a series of cardboard tubes with mirrors on the end of them, the only way that you can get a picture from a server onto your computer is by downloading it. When we say stream, what we mean is I'm going to let you download this, but I assume that the program that you're downloading it with doesn't have a save button, right? You're still downloading it, right? So everything we do involves making copies, and not just like one, but like a jillion copies, right? Like when you stream a video, it's not like there's a copy on the server and a copy on your computer and that's it, right? Like every router in between you and there is making a copy, and then like your frame buffer and your video card is making a copy, and there's a RAM copy, and there's transitory copies all over. There's like 1,000 copies, right? Before breakfast every day. Well, the idea that you have to understand entertainment law, this like super esoteric industrial regulation, to be in the audience, it just brings the whole thing into disrepute, right? Like if I actually want my publisher to live up to copyright law, then it's in my interest for copyright law to be in good odor. And if we tell like 13-year-olds who are writing fanfic, which is a thing that 13-year-olds have done since time immemorial. My editor and I once bonded over the fact that when we were 13, we each wrote our own separate Conan fanfic novel, although he's, 20 years older than me. But for decades, science fiction people were doing this. If we're going to say to a 13-year-old, you got to go and get a license, and if you don't, you're a criminal, what we're really teaching them is that copyright is bullshit. Right? Just stop paying attention to copyright. It's bullshit. Right? And like, that's not what I want. I want there to be a set of robust rules that regulate the supply chain of my industry that are fair to me. And if we ever get those rules, I don't want people to go, oh, those rules are bullshit. We should never pay attention to them. Right? So we've created this bizarre circumstance now where everything we do involving the internet is regulated by copyright, by entertainment industry regulation. So like, for example, once there was this early internet dating site where someone set up a profile of me that wasn't me. And the way that I found out about it is I started to get email from people who were like, you set up that date with me and I showed up and you weren't there. I was like, oh, this isn't just like a little bit creepy. This is a lot creepy. Like if this person starts killing people, that's going to be really bad. So I called up the dating site, right? I found their phone number because I'm good at internet, right? Even then, no one put their phone number anywhere, but I found their phone number. And I called them up and I started speaking to them. And they're like, oh no, we got a solution for this. Just send a copyright notice over the photo they used and we'll take down the profile. I'm like, but I didn't actually take that picture. It's not my copyrighted work. And besides, like, it's probably fair use. Like what is the, how is copyright the thing that we reach for to stop people from impersonating each other on dating sites, right? Like that's just weird. And, as someone who like wants a good copyright so that I don't get cheated by the major corporations that I rely on to pay my mortgage and put my kid through school, I don't want copyright stretched to cover like, what are we going to do about, Nazis organizing and harassing on Twitter? I know we'll make copyright notice. In fact, this is a, brain genius thing people do. They're like, I'm going to go to a rally of people I disagree with and play loud copyrighted music so when they stream it, they'll get takedown notices. The Beverly Hills cops here in Los Angeles have started playing loud music when people come in to live stream their encounters with the cops, right? Like this is just dumb, right? It is an outrage and an idiocy. And here's the thing. In 1976, the US passed a new copyright law. And the 76 Act brought the U.S. into compliance with the Berne Convention, which is the global regime on copyright. And that Berne Convention has since been enshrined in other instruments that the U.S. has acceded to, like the World Trade Organization's TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property something, and many other treaties, WIPO Copyright Treaty, the WIPO Phonograms and Performers Treaties, and so on. And what Berne says is that copyright has to adhere automatically without any formalities. So prior to 76, if you wanted a copyright, you had to take the work that you were copywriting, you had to mail it to the Copyright Office with a check. And that was probably too cumbersome. And certainly by today's standards, that's way too cumbersome. You should be able to just like upload it with a click, and it shouldn't cost anything, right? Or it should cost a penny or something. You buy a 100 pack for $1, right? But that formality meant that only things that people explicitly wanted all rights reserved on were in copyright. And things that weren't explicitly copyrighted were presumptively in the public domain. And it also had this like super beneficial secondary effect, as befits like people who make their living from it, which is that the Copyright Office had a list of who you should call if you wanted to give someone money for a copyrighted work, right? You find like a photo or a book in the wild and you're like, I'm going to pay that person a lot of money for a license to that work. The Copyright Office would tell you their phone number and you could call them up and write them a check. Now, because we've abolished formalities, and the US has got like this thing where, well, if you want statutory damages, you have to register your copyright. But still, like 99.99999999999% of copyrighted works are not registered. And a huge plurality of those have no known proprietor, right? It would cost more to figure out who to license them from than you could potentially, ever realize from them. Every Instagram photo, right? Every email sent, every tweet has a copyright, right? And none of those are being registered with the US Copyright Office. And so what Creative Commons did was they said, look, there are some people who would like a more permissive regime. And as it stands, because of the 76 Act, because of the abolition of formalities, if you don't want all rights reserved, you have to go pay a lawyer like $10,000 to write a license agreement to sit at the bottom of your all rights reserved item that says, I'm not going to reserve all the rights, right? And Creative Commons was like, all right, why don't we just pay one group of lawyers once? They're just going to write some standard crap you can stick at the bottom of your thing. We'll make it machine readable so you can go to a search engine and say, find me the Creative Commons licensed stuff under these terms. And they set up some like basic terms, right? Commercial, non-commercial use allowed, share alike or not share alike. So do you have to, like, if you make something new with my work, do you have to share it on the same terms that I gave it to you? Do you need to attribute me? Just a few, like it's really like 4 tick boxes that you choose, and then it spits out a license. And then they did something super cool and weird, which is they went all over the world and they hired law professors to write licenses that were equivalent in every other legal system, such that they could be mixed and matched. So you find some audio from like an Italian composer that's CC licensed. And then you find some like Blender sprites, 3D sprites that were made by some kid in Malaysia that are also CC licensed. And then you get some like a short story that was written by a Palestinian and it's CC licensed. And then you get some South Africans' background paintings that are CC licensed. And if the licenses are compatible, you can merge them together to make an animation without having to pay a lawyer, right? Without anyone paying a lawyer, right? And it's square in all of those legal systems, which is just like, I'm not a copyright lawyer, but I spent a lot of time with them. I used to be like a treaty negotiator on copyright treaties at the UN and stuff for NGOs. And like, this is the copyright lawyer equivalent of like a triple Lutz or something. Like, it's like some insanely difficult thing. It's like, juggling live chainsaws while grooming a kitten or something. Like, it's this bizarre and improbable stunt. And it's super cool. And, I love the Creative Commons folks. I think they're trying to figure out what to do now. Like, they're doing some pretty cool tooling. They've got like better search tools and so on. But like, kind of the point of CC was it was a one and done, right? Yeah. Like you make the licenses and now we got the licenses. There's like billions of works in Creative Commons. So that, that's great. And I use different CC licenses for different work that I do. I have a daily blog where I write between like 1 and 5 essays, some of them very significant essays, and they're licensed in the second most permissive license there is, which is the attribution license that says, you can use this in any way, including making money, and you can change it and you can translate it. You can do anything you want with it. You just have to say that you found it on my website and give a link. The only more permissive version of that is the Creative Commons 0 license, which is you can do all of that and you don't even have to tell anyone that you got it from me, right? So that's like a very permissive license. I use less permissive licenses on other stuff. And like you said, I've done a lot of my books under these licenses, predominantly prohibiting commercial use. because that's, how I pay my mortgage. But it's been very productive, very good for me. I've had little to no negative experiences with CC, except really at the most extreme margins. Like every now and again, there's been a thing like my foreign rights agents have shown up at like an Italian publisher. And the Italian publisher has said, I see this Creative Commons amateur translation, and our market is so small that if like 20 people don't buy our edition because they get that edition for free, it's not worth it for us. And, I get that. It's one of the reasons I stopped using derivatives allowed licenses on my commercial works, because I didn't want that. But at the same time, those translations were so powerful for me. Like a group of Persian diaspora volunteers translated it into Persian and spread it around in Iran during one of the elections. One of my books around Iran during one of the elections. Same thing happened with Burmese in Myanmar during not the current coup, but an earlier coup. And so, I'm kind of torn on that one too. And I kind of wish, that's where I wish we just had more flexibility in copyright. Like, I would just like it to be legal for people to do fan translations and to not require a license. And so that would just shift the norms about what foreign publishers expected. But, so far, so good. That's a long answer, but it's a big question.
And I think one of the pieces there is the kind of the rise of, it's starting as early as the late 1970s when the first sequencers came out, remix culture, which has extended to everything. And even if you look at the current NFT movement, the people that are kind of doing some of the most interesting NFT things it's all street art and pop art, young artists that are doing things. And I think in a way, not only did you use this licensing, but you've also celebrated this remix culture in your work as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously everything is a remix, right? As the old saying goes. The writer that I'm not related to, E.L Doctorow, who's a very famous writer who's dead and who I'm not related to, wrote a great book called The Creators, which is a collection of essays about where creation comes from. And the first essay is about Genesis. And it turns out that Genesis was Hebrew fanfic of the Babylonian origin story, right? So, and you can go further back than that. You can go to Ulysses, right? Like we have the idea that we retell stories is really deeply ingrained in our in the way that we operate, and this kind of iterative process where you take a thing and you combine it with something else. And maybe you forget where what your inspiration was, or you deliberately obscure it to claim some kind of heroic authorship. That's a really old process too. And if you believe E.L Doctorow and the creators, it's interesting that the reason the Babylonians thought that the creation story was true is they thought that it was so cool that they couldn't imagine having thought it up themselves. They were like, the fact that I thought this up and it's this cool means that God actually put it in my head because I'm not that smart, right? So, that's kind of, we've had different shifting ways of thinking about creativity. But, I always think about when my daughter was born, we were living in London at the time. I grew up in Toronto. My mom's an early childhood ed specialist. She did her doctorate in early childhood ed and knows a lot about early childhood development. And she came over to hang out with us after the kid was born. And the kid was like a week old, right? And so my mom picks her up and says, like, have you stuck your tongue out at her yet? And I said, no, Mom, I haven't stuck my tongue out of my newborn yet. Like, do tell, right? And she does this, right? She goes, and my daughter, who's so small, she doesn't even really know she has a tongue yet. Like, she doesn't have the coordination to like reliably hit her tongue with her hand, right? She looks back up at my mom and goes, because we copy like we nuzzle for the breast, right? Like it's really built in, this idea that individual action is the result of observing other people, reproducing what they've done, and then putting your own spin on it. Like we have a name for things that don't copy themselves. We call them, dead. We call them extinct, right? Like, 4 billion years ago, through a process that we're not really clear on, complex molecules started reproducing themselves. That's where we came from, right? So the idea that like we would demonize copying as a failure to really come to grips with the originality that every artist has as their duty it's just bizarre. I mean, my daughter's name is Posey, and she's partly named after Edgar Allan Poe. We spell it Poesy, like the French word for poetry, but mostly it's because I wanted a Poe reference in there. And Poe did a lot of things, a lot of amazing things. He invented the mystery novel, right? Murders in the Rue Morgue. Like, we didn't have mystery stories as we understand them today before Poe, right? And we take Poe, we take his invention, right, the mystery novel, and we all write mystery novels. I just finished a mystery novel called Red Team Blues. And none of us feel like Edgar Allan Poe is owed a debt over that, or like the world would be better served if there were some like lawyers representing his heirs who decided who could write mystery novels. And we don't say who will invent the next genre if you can't be assured that everyone who works in that genre can write mystery novels, right? Like that, for me, like championing Remix is not about being like a maverick who believes in, some kind of intellectual commons, although I am that too. I believe in that too. It's about just being like intellectually honest, right? Not maintaining the pretense that, the part of the story that is the part that I stole from someone else is just plumbing that didn't require any originality. And the part that I added is like this unique snowflake that could have only originated from my amazing brain, and having the humility to acknowledge that, creativity is like, it's syncretic, right? You take a little of this, you take a little of that, you swirl it all together, you file the serial numbers off, you call it yours.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, just in our personal day-to-day life, even people who are not creators or writers or inventors or entrepreneurs or anything, we seem to have a little bit of a deficit of our own ability to just remix and imagine, play. I think we're so inundated with high quality entertainment, high quality being in quotes because it's not really quality. It's just the fastest remix of the week. And we encourage people to think, if you're going to think about the future, you've got to use your imagination. You can't like pull the future off the shelf. And so, we look to writers that do speculative fiction. You're a writer that in a way speculates on pieces. You exaggerate certain things and other things to kind of make an allegorical point about our current conditions. But that ability to just imagine seems to be something that we want to unleash in people, to have a base level of creativity that's not reserved for creators. Sure.
I mean, I somewhat dispute the idea that we're not doing creative stuff. Like, I think that, it's very interesting because like one of the things I campaign on is monopoly and competition, especially in the digital world. And, many people have observed that Facebook has a pretty durable monopoly over social media. But I was just as surprised as everyone else when TikTok came along, right? Mm-hmm. And its precursor, I forget what it was called, Musical.ly. You can tell I have a 13-year-old, right? There are lots of problems with TikTok, right? It's like super extractive and, whatever, right? But like it's like watching folk art emerge in real time, right? Like you have kids who will create a dance, right? They'll create a set of like choreography that is on the one hand, like obviously part of a genre of choreography. TikTok dancing is very weird because mostly it's done with like a phone tripod or phone on a desk, and it's almost entirely waist up, which is very interesting. It's like a form of dance that's fully waist up. In the same way that I imagine that like in an era where women wore very large hoop skirts, that the footwork was pretty like a lot less intricate, right? Like you had to land in the right spot, but like the actual like, precision foot movements were less significant than they might be if you could, see their feet, right? And so, they create this dance that's part of a genre, and then they upload it. And then other people will take it and they'll do things like do a duet with it. So they'll try to see if they can reproduce it, but they'll also see if they can produce a variant of it. And then they'll do things, I'm sure you've seen these, where they'll cut the frame in the middle and they'll have the original from this side down and themselves from this side up, and they'll try to synchronize it either to reproduce what's being done or to comment on it, right? Like to parody it or to do something, to imply something else is going on. These are really fabulously creative things. And, they're creating like in-camera editing techniques. Like literally I walked in one day and my kid was like putting grease on the lens to create like a soft focus. And then like she had a way of cleaning it off. And she improvised like a green filter and a red filter, and then did 2 different makeup scenes, and then went into the bathroom and had lights that she would turn on and off at different times. And this was stuff that came from TikTok that she had reproduced, but also remixed and uploaded so other people could remix it. So I feel like, I don't feel like we have a crisis in remixing. I think what we have is a crisis of like permission culture, right? Like, and also, every pirate wants to be an admiral, right? Like when I do it, it's progress. When you do it, it's theft. And so, my kid and her friends will say things like, I came up with that, copyright me, which, obviously they're just trolling me. But at the same time, right, like there is this impetus that to think about your contribution as special, precious, unique, and like a meaningful new thing on the earth, and everyone else's contribution as like an obvious piece of plumbing that should be available to anyone. And if we were going to do creativity policy, like if we were going to say, oh, how do we make sure that we're as creative as possible? We would try to extinguish that. We'd try to help people identify and extinguish that in the same way that we might try to identify and extinguish, like, when I take a bite of your pizza, I feel like it's fine. But when you take a bite of my pizza, I feel like you're being like a jerk, right? And we try to help people like understand that those are equivalent acts. It's sometimes, and I think behavioral economists call it the fundamental attribution error, right? When I am slightly distracted while driving and cut you off, that's because everyone's human and nobody's perfect. When you do it, it's because you're a menace to society who should be taken off the road, right? So we would, like, we were doing good policy, we would try and like help people avoid the fundamental attribution error in creativity as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned a bit TikTok being extractive, and I know you have a workout on surveillance capitalism. How do these things fit together, and what do you think is some of the remedies for that, or some things we should be aware of? I mean, obviously, surveillance. And like some of the things going on right now with Apple, we're trying to reduce the amount of surveillance, although only reducing the ones that are not beneficial to Apple at this point, not all of surveillance. These are really big issues. And I think most people don't even have a handle on it. Either the extractive part of it, by the way, I don't think anybody realized when they're uploading their video to TikTok that they are providing content for TikTok. And then, and that by watching TikTok, I'm actually giving you data.
Yeah. So let me start maybe by saying that I disagree with the predominant surveillance capitalism hypothesis. This book that I wrote, How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism, is a rebuttal to Zuboff, who is the kind of the person most closely associated with this, Shoshana Zuboff. Although it looks like the term was actually coined by some lefty Canadian social studies scholars who agree more with me than her, but she really popularized her own version of it. And in her version, capitalism is fine. Capitalism is this system whereby we all make decisions about what we want and how much we're willing to pay for it. And those decisions create a system, and that system produces an efficient allocation. It's the way to decide who gets what by having prices and price signals, production, and so on.
Yeah, old school market economics. The market will produce all the magic you need to make humanity work.
Like the 1920s socialist calculation debate, where like von Hayek and Mises were like, you could never build a computer big enough to do an efficient allocation. That computer is called the market. That's what it does. And if there are problems at the periphery, those are just like the necessary imperfections we have to admit in order to build the computer, right? In the same way that a computer might produce exhaust heat or something, sometimes it produces, piles of apples on a dock with no ship to pick them up or something. And that's just like
trillionaires.
Yeah, or trillionaires, right? That's just part of the deal. So Zuboff, she calls surveillance capitalism a rogue capitalism. She says that when you look at what the tech companies say they can do, the ad tech companies, Facebook and Google most notably, they say that if they spy on us enough, they can get us to do anything, right? They can analyze that data and turn it into an influence campaign that will get us to do stuff. And that is what they say, right? Like, it's what they tell advertisers, right? Like, buy a Google ad. We won't just figure out, like, if you want to sell like left-handed bottle openers, we won't just find you beer drinkers who are left-handed. We will actually figure out how to pitch the left-handed bottle opener message so that all those left-handed beer drinkers that you show your ad to go out and buy your product, right? They also say that, their political advertising side says that to politicians, right? Like, it's not just that we can help you find racists. We can help you convince racists to vote for you, right? And they also publish papers claiming to do this. Facebook has this paper where they describe how they did an unregulated, non-consensual psychological experiment on 60 million people, where they showed them a stimulus that was they hypothesized would increase the likelihood that they would vote. And they had something like 300,000 of them, more than they had predicted, actually did go out and vote after being exposed to the stimulus. And she says, and then also there are these patents, right? Google files patents saying, like, we've figured out how to combine this kind of data mining to produce these behavioral outcomes. And she says, well, that's not capitalism anymore, because in a market, you make a choice. The market is the computer adds up all the choices and does the allocation. But in surveillance capitalism, the company decides what you'll do, and then you just do it. And so we short circuit the ability of the market to understand what people want and how badly they want it, which is what prices are supposed to determine. And I think this is wrong, right? I just think that, like, everyone who ever claimed to have a mind control ray was either kidding themselves or kidding you. And that the claims that she relies on, or the sources that she relies on for these claims, are not reliable sources. So, for example, the marketing materials that companies produce to sell their services and products to their customers are not disinterested, right? They're not empirical findings. They're what do they call it when there are libel suits? There's a word for this: mere puffery. They're mere puffery, right? That Facebook study, they did in fact move a couple 100,000 people to vote, and there are elections that turn a lot fewer than a couple 100,000 votes. The effect size was 0.38%, right? So that is not like a gross change in the behavior of people. Like, a 0.38% get out the vote is there aren't elections that are that close. And yeah, they got a couple 100,000 people to turn out across 60 million. So, like, there aren't elections of 60 million people that turn on a couple 100,000 votes that are all in, like, just distributed randomly across all precincts, right? So even if we think that's a problem, it's not that big a problem. And I'm not saying that, like, a company that performs non-consensual psychological experiments on 60 million people is a good company, right? Like, the fact that Facebook thought they could could manipulate our behavior disqualifies them from running a lemonade stand, right? Yeah, they should not be in charge of the social lives of 2.6 billion people. Like, on that, we should all agree, right? But one thing we know about behavioral interventions is that they regress to the mean, right? That, like, stimulus stops being noticeable after a while. I'm recording this in my office, which is also the garage, which is also the laundry room. And before we started recording, I have a little note next to my camera that says, turn off the washing machine, because it's super loud, but I only hear it for the first 10 seconds. Right. And then it just disappears. Right. We all know this. Right. So even if Facebook could move 0.38% of the people out to the polls, there's at least a good reason to expect that if they did it again, it wouldn't be 0.38%, it might be 0.24%, right? And that it would continue to decline, that they'd be locked in this limbic arms race. And then finally, patents are they're just like a cesspool of garbage. Software patents do not require that you demonstrate a working invention. You can patent a time machine, you can patent a perpetual motion machine, a zero-point energy machine, and it's just claiming you can do it. You don't have to describe how. And so patents are they're just full of lies. And so, you take all of this and you add it up and you get these extraordinary claims with very thin evidence. But Zuboff makes a really important point, which is that when a business can foreclose on your ability to choose freely, that's not a good society. It's not good if you believe in markets. It's not good if you believe in human rights. It's not good if you believe in the democratic fundamental idea that people should be able to self-actualize and to have self-determination, because individuals know for themselves better than anyone else about their lived experience. Karl Marx said that we should unionize workers because workers understand the factory better than the bosses. But von Hayek said that we should stop having central planning because economic actors know their needs better than anyone else, right? Like, this is the horseshoe with Karl Marx and von Hayek on either side of it coming together. The one thing they all agree on is self-determination, right? So I think that there are lots of ways in which tech companies strip us of our self-determination. Like Facebook has blocked interoperability, and they've done so specifically to stop people from leaving Facebook while staying in touch with their Facebook friends. It's like they put a Berlin Wall around Facebook so that if you leave Facebook, you don't just leave Facebook's surveillance, you leave the benefits of Facebook as well. It's like, my grandmother was she was a civil defense worker in the siege of Leningrad when she was 13. So she was basically a child soldier. And then she got evacuated to Siberia. She served in the Red Army. And then after the war, she and my grandfather destroyed their papers and they went to Canada. That's how I ended up being raised in Canada. And for 15 years, she lost touch with her family, right? She didn't just have to give up everything she owned. She had to give up every social tie she had. It was a brutal, terrible, wrenching decision. And the rest of her family couldn't make it, right? They all stayed behind in Leningrad, right? Facebook has built a Berlin Wall. Facebook has not only acquired this network effect where you join Facebook because your friends are there, but they've acquired a switching cost, which is that you don't leave Facebook because when you do, you can't stay in touch with your friends. And there's nothing about Facebook that's intrinsically like that. In fact, when Facebook started, it had this problem, which is that everyone who wanted to use social media already had an account on the largest social media service the world had ever seen, owned by this like rapacious, hyper-competitive, litigious billionaire named Rupert Murdoch, right? And Rupert was not going to let his people go. And so like, even though Facebook had a better interface and they were more private, they used to sell on privacy, Facebook. They were like, MySpace is going to mine your data. Facebook won't mine your data ever, right? And the way that they got around that is they didn't organize like International Leave MySpace Day, right? Where everybody just like, tomorrow we all go from here to like the Swedes did, I think in New Year's Eve 1967, the Swedes went from driving on the left to driving on the right. And at midnight, like all of these city workers fanned out and turned the roadsides around, right? No one did that, right? You could do that in Sweden because almost no one had a car and it's a small country population wise, right? But no one tried to do that with Facebook. With Facebook, they made a bot. And you told that bot what your login and password was, and it would run off to MySpace. It would scrape all the messages waiting for your MySpace, come back to Facebook and put them in your inbox. And you could type your reply, and then it would take them and push them back in your MySpace inbox. Put a little footer at the bottom, said, I sent this from Facebook. Why the hell are you still on MySpace, right? Facebook sues companies that do that to Facebook, right? Because when they did it, it was progress. When you do it, it's piracy, because every pirate wants to be an admiral, because everyone kicks the ladder away when they get to the top of it. So Facebook does control our behavior, right? They've tricked us all into this act of mutual hostage state taking, where you can't leave Facebook because I'm there and I can't leave Facebook because you're there. And that is this huge incursion on our self-determination and free will. And it has everything to do with being a monopoly and almost nothing to do with manipulation, right? Google is the answer to all of our questions. And Google answers our questions, and sometimes they get it wrong. And this has a huge outsized effect on our society and our civilization and our discourse. But it's not because Google has a mind control, Ray. It's because Google grew using monopolistic tactics that were prohibited until the Reagan era, namely doing predatory acquisitions of other companies to maintain its monopoly, right? Google is a company that has made 1.5 successful products. They made a great search engine and a pretty good Hotmail clone. Everything else they've done is something that they bought from someone else. YouTube, Android, the entire ad tech stack came from someone else. Their data center technology came from other companies. Their customer service stuff came from other companies. Their calendaring program, their office suite, all of it came from other companies. They bought it in acquisitions that would have been prohibited under traditional antitrust enforcement. Not only that, but everything they built in-house, because they try, it all failed, right? Loon, Google Plus, Sidewalk Labs, Google Reader, they shut it all down. So, Google acquired this centrality to our discourse, not by having the best answers, but by having the best access to the capital markets so they could acquire any potential competitors and to acquire complementary and adjacent businesses to maintain a monopoly. And Apple has this gigantic control over our behavior. They lobbied to kill 20 state-level right to repair bills. They abuse copyright law to make it illegal to fix their devices. They abuse copyright law to make it illegal to add another app store to their devices. So they and they alone get to decide what can be in there. These are if you're worried about 0.38% of people casting a vote when they wouldn't have, you should be very worried about 100% of iPhone owners only buying their stuff from one store, even when less than 100% of them want to buy from just one store, right? So my thesis is that if you care about the things that Zuboff says she cares about, that you shouldn't get mired in discussions about how the mind control ray worked, that you should instead embark on muscular pro-competition law, not because we fetishize choice or markets, but because people have a dignified life when they get to decide how their technology lives and works. And you don't get any democratic control over a corporation beyond buy and not buy. And you cannot shop your way out of a monopoly capitalism, right? You are not an ambulatory wallet, and ambulatory wallets are impotent, useless things compared to citizens.
Yeah, and it begs that we need some kind of revised governance. You spoke about Reagan and the deregulation of monopolies, also the strengthening of patent law, and we've seen case law and courts award patent kind of patent sharks out there for 20 years now, and it feels like sometimes inside of it that's just the way it is, but governance is something we decided upon. We wrote laws, we put laws in place, and then we have courts interpret those laws. It seems that to me, a lot of the things you're speaking about the monopoly, and certainly around the area of privacy, perceived privacy, what is my private space, what is not. Those are begging for some kind of governance, but it just seems that our government really can't move fast enough or understand fast enough to deal with these issues. Now come on, Facebook has been however long, 14 years or something like that now, 15 years. It's not like it's new anymore. It's not like we don't have time to consider the problem. It feels to me that if we're looking forward into a world that works better for people's own individual sovereignty, choice, as you said it, then we have to have better governance. Not governance led by the corporations themselves who are making profit off of us.
For sure. Well, and to understand how we got here, it wasn't like an epiphenomenon of the technology, right? Like it wasn't just that like we figured out silicon transistors and then we got monopolies, right? There was nothing foreordained about this. We changed our monopoly theory, our theory of when we should enforce against monopolies and why, at the same year the Apple II Plus came on the market, right? And the enforcement actions sort of petered out over the years that followed to the point where the kind of muscular anti-monopoly, pro-competition enforcement that made tech very dynamic, where, yesterday's giant was today's, scrap heap, that just got eliminated. And monopolies are self-reinforcing, and this gets to like why we enforce against monopolies to begin with. So, the framers of the Constitution were super suspicious of monopolies. Ironically, George Mason, who like the university named after him is the most pro-monopoly university in the country. George Mason unsuccessfully tried to get anti-monopoly language stuck in the U.S. Constitution. A bunch of the original colonies constitutions had like these explicit like there will be no monopolies language that just didn't make it through the Constitutional Convention in the 76. And the first antitrust laws, the Sherman Act in the late 19th century, were pretty clear that like monopolies were bad because they were monopolies. That when you gathered a bunch of power into the unaccountable hands of an individual, a baron, rail baron, a steel baron, that, it didn't matter how wise they were because they wouldn't get it right all the time. And because there was no democratic checks on their power, if they got it wrong, that wrongness would ripple out over society and there'd be no remedy for it. And, they were actually wrong more often than they were right. I mean, even if you believe in the philosopher king, they're not infallible, but none of these people were philosopher kings. They were venal dickheads, right? What's his name? Mellon, as in Carnegie Mellon, Andrew Mellon. They called him the man who owned an element because he owned all the aluminum in the world. He was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he would do things like get the U.S. government to get into trade deals with Colombia so that he could have all their aluminum. And during the war, he was like, I'm not going to let the aerospace industry have enough aluminum to make airplanes because it'll depress the price. They had to shut down aircraft factories because the Secretary of the Treasury was like, yeah, I've got this side hustle where I own all the aluminum and I'm just not going to let it go, right? So these people were they were venal, evil scumbags. And so, that was the anti-monopoly theory was we just shouldn't have monopolies. And the thing about a political theory of monopoly, where you hate monopolies because you think that politics work best when we have a democratic governance, is that everyone has a say in it, right? Like you are an expert on how living under a monopoly makes you feel as part of a polity or a democracy. And there was the Chicago School, right? The economists who are the architects of neoliberalism, who had this idea that once you allowed subjective judgments to come into it, we couldn't have equality before the law. That if two companies tried to effect a merger and they were blocked because the people who lived in that town or under those circumstances made a good case to a regulator, that it would undermine their self-determination, undermine fairness. And then two other companies that were similar got to go through with their merger because no one made that case, that you wouldn't have equal treatment under the law. And then you have to take all these subjective elements out of the law and replace them with an empirical judgment, which was, will this harm consumers? Now, the thing is, like a lot of claims about empiricism, is it wasn't very empirical, right? Like the will this harm consumers is a subjective judgment, right? Because yeah, obviously every company is going to say, no, it's good for consumers, right? We won't raise prices, right? And if they do raise prices, they're always going to say, oh, no, we didn't raise prices because we're a greedy monopoly. We raised prices because the moon is in Venus, or because, labor costs went up, or energy costs more between 9 and 11 a.m. And that's when we got to run the most expensive machine, or whatever, right? You have to decide whether you're going to believe them. That's still a subjective decision. Mm-hmm. But they said, oh, no, we're not going to make it subjective. We're going to build these mathematical models. Now, by this incredible coincidence, only we understand how these models work, only we can build them, and only we can interpret them. And if you want to merge two companies, you just have to come and ask us, and we'll build a model and tell you whether your two companies should be merged, right? It's like the sorcerer in the court saying, bring me a goat and my sacrificial knife, and I will tell you whether the king's campaign will be successful, right? And if you go and you go oh, I've been looking at those goat's guts and I don't see anything like you're saying. They're like, oh, look who thinks he could read the goat's guts, huh? So, 40 years later, every time you want to merge a company, you get these assholes to kill a goat and tell you that it'll be fine. And they say it'll be fine. And it's not fine, right?
Never fine.
And, Facebook acquired Instagram. And they acquired Instagram explicitly because they knew that teenagers hated Facebook and they were using Instagram instead. And they said so. And when the European Commission said to them, we think this is going to concentrate the market for social media unduly, they said, oh, no, Instagram's not a social media company. They're a camera app. And so Facebook owns 0% of the camera app market, and Instagram's only 1% of the camera app market because everyone's got a camera app that came with their phone and not everyone has Instagram. So we're only going to have 1% of the market. Well, this was an idiotic argument. No one should have listened to it. They lied. We know they lied. We've seen documents since that said they lied. We should unwind that merger. We should penalize them. They say, oh, no, you can't unwind the merger. Nick Clegg used to be the deputy prime minister of the United Kingdom, is the world's greatest sellout and now runs their international side. He's like, you can't break up Facebook because China will win. And besides, you have no idea how expensive it would be to unwind this merger now that we made it. We've done so much IT work. It's yeah, that's why we should do it. Because we want everyone who comes afterwards to know that if you lie to a regulator, we're going to make you unwind the lie. And if it's expensive, great. Because sometimes, as Camus said, you got to execute an admiral to encourage the others, right? And that would be, that is the remedy we could seek. And it doesn't require that our lawmakers be technical. And it doesn't require that they be young, right? That they not be a parliament of septuagenarians. Because none of them are microbiology experts, but we're not all dying of giardia from our water supply, right? They're capable of having experts who adjudicate difficult technical questions in ways that come out to an answer that doesn't result in the extinction of our species, right? So, none of that is required. All that's required is the will to act against concentrated corporate power. And while there's a lot of concentrated corporate power across a lot of domains, there's also a lot of will to check it because it's across so many domains. So you and I are pissed pissed off about Facebook, but there's a lot of wrestling fans who are pissed off about the fact that Vince McMahon bought all the other wrestling leagues, just like Google bought all of its competitors. And then just like Google is able to do, they reclassified their workers as contractors. They misclassified their labor force, took away their health insurance. And now every wrestler that anyone ever loved is like dying of work-related injuries in their 50s and begging for pennies on GoFundMe so they can die with dignity, right? All those people don't know it. They think that they're wrestling fairness campaigners. What they actually are is anti-monopoly campaigners.
Right.
And so is everyone who's pissed off about there being 2 brewers, 1 eyeglass manufacturer, 3 major record labels, 4 major studios, 1 movie theater chain. If you're pissed off about that, you're not on the side of more movie theater chains. You're on the side of less monopoly. And so we have the opportunity to build a coalition that can check that power.
Yeah, great. And obviously something that, especially our listeners, which we are always encouraging and to get into action on certain things that you can learn more about. I want to recommend your book. What is it called?
How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism.
Certainly. And you can go to CoryDoctorow.com and see that book, get that book from there.
No.
Yes. No.
Craphound.com.
Oh, sorry. Craphound. Sorry. You don't.
I don't know who owns CoryDoctorow.com. Some weirdo domain speculator.
Oh my goodness. That's horrible that happened to you. Craphound. And Craphound was your original blog. Is that correct? Or you
first short story I sold to a professional market.
And so that was the first domain you thought to.
I also have a daily blog at pluralistic.net.
Okay, well, we'll make sure everybody gets links to that in the show notes. And I want to talk a little bit about the book Walkaway, because I think of all of your work, it certainly, to me, it represented a different kind of speculation on the future, because you really took on culture and society. You took on the way that we organize ourselves in collectives. I have some ideas about the sources of some of that, but what I really am interested in is 2 parts. First of all, is that in the story, people walk away from a very highly intermediated, highly instrumentalized, and technologized society. They leave that behind, and I'm curious about looking at our societal and cultural evolution. Are we destined to need to walk away from what we've created? Or was that just a literary device? And what is the in-between of that? How do we get into, most of the things we've talked about in this conversation thus far have been incremental changes to make certain things that don't work well work better. But if we look at a longer term future for humanity, maybe a 100-year time frame, we have to begin to question when the culture and society we have built become the limiting factor for human beings. Obviously, when we look at climate change and climate crisis, we can see that our structure is actually limiting us from doing the things that we need to do. Talk to me a little bit about that and help me kind of understand what that path forward might look like.
So it was kind of a commentary on the so-called automation crisis. So, first of all, the automation crisis is like hugely overblown, right? Right. Everyone's heard that trucker is the most common job in America, and trucker is the easiest to automate with automated trucks. Neither of those things turn out to be true. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has this like 1 category for heavy goods vehicle drivers, and it includes like the person who delivers like groceries and the UPS person, and also 16-wheeler long haulers and like everything in between. And only one tiny segment of it, the long haul stuff, is considered to be amenable to automation. And only then if you like have dedicated lanes with like a Jersey barrier concrete median in which only the automated vehicles are allowed. And we have a name for a vehicle that goes in its own dedicated lane. It's called a train. So basically we can build a shitty train, and that might make a tiny fraction of truck drivers obsolete. Right. That is not a crisis. But even if it were, we very, very clearly, as you say, have a lot of labor ahead of us in terms of climate remediation. Right? We're probably going to have to relocate every coastal city in the world 20 kilometers inland. That's like a 300-year project. It's going to need every single person's labor, all the labor that the human race has available to it for the next 300 years. And so if we were to free up people with automation, there's a job for them, right? And there's lots of jobs for them. But we misallocate, as you said, right? Like we have these crazy misallocations that are being driven by market failures, where we are allocating lots of money to things that are superfluous and not nearly enough money to like preserving our species, right? And so these folks, they do walk away, but they don't walk away from technology. They walk away from a technological world where they lack self-determination, right, and walk towards a world where they have lots more of it. And they do so by squatting on sacrifice zones, brownfield sites that are considered too environmentally degraded, and they use technology to rehabilitate those sites. And so, they are in fact not walking away from the world. They're walking towards, they're leaning into the multi-century long species-wide project of remediating the foolish choices of our ancestors and ourselves. And that was kind of the story I wanted to get at there.
Yeah, and it's a great book, by the way. Probably my favorite work of yours to date, just because of the depth of its complexity and the journey of the characters in the book. But also, yes, that they use technology, but they use it much more in a remix culture kind of way. And if you think about, like we mentioned, 4 websites out there right now that dominate most of our time. These kind of large monopolistic uses of technology, where it's, yes, we choose to open Facebook, but it's not like we have a lot of other choice, as you said. And it starts to become an intermediated experience. Facebook chooses which friends I get to see.
Yeah,
they choose. Their algorithm chooses. Netflix chooses which movies I get to watch. And I think that in the book, they use the technology to other ends, other than this intermediated existence.
Yeah, seize the means of computation. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and here we are. It's Karl Marx's birthday as we're recording. So, fair enough.
Yeah. And so I think as we look, and also I'm really curious so there's technology in there, there's walking away from society, but there's also these really interesting explorations of notions of family or community in that book. Talk to us a little bit about that, because that's also an evolutionary impulse right now for human beings, is how do we collect together and make decisions together?
Yeah, well, look, Ronald Coase is part of that Chicago economics school, but he was a pretty bright guy, had some good ideas. Won the fake Nobel Prize. The economics Nobel Prize is not a real Nobel Prize. Economists were really sad that no one took them seriously, so they made up another prize and called it the Nobel Prize. But he got the not a Nobel Prize in economics in 1937 for a paper called The Theory of the Firm, in which he explores like why we have institutions. Like, why do you have a government or a family or a church or a corporation or a crime syndicate or a football team? And he said, the reason to do it is that if you want to do something that exceeds the ability of one person, right, something that is more ambitious than you yourself can do, then you need to coordinate, right? If you and someone else are like knitting a sweater together, you have to make sure you're not both knitting the left arm, right? Or that one of you isn't knitting and the other one's unraveling it at the other end to get the wool to knit the sweater with, right? And so that means you have to have a meeting, right? You have to have a process. You have to have a way to check in with each other. And every bit of transaction cost, every bit of meeting and foofara and bureaucracy that we have is time that we don't get to spend doing stuff. And so we make institutions to make efficient structures to organize the collective effort of more than one person. And what the internet has done is it's steadily driven down the cost of doing collective effort. Like, for example, if you have a truth about something in Wikipedia, there is a process for adding it. It's not like a free-for-all, you may have to make a citation or whatever, but you just get to add it, right? There isn't like, you don't have to have a meeting with someone to fix their typo. You can just fix a typo. I find typos in Wikipedia articles all the time, and I fix them all the time. It's really easy. And that very low coordination cost allows us to do things that are very ambitious, like writing an operating system or writing an encyclopedia. These are like same order of magnitude of complexity as like running a space program. And we do them with the kind of bureaucracy that we would normally associate with like a super ambitious bake sale. And so, so it's like not nothing, right? It's something. There's a lot, like Wikipedians will tell you all day long that there's a big wrangle in being a hardcore Wikipedian, right? But it's compared to being an employee of the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's pretty lightweight. And so Walkaway kind of asks the question, like, what if you could build a skyscraper or a space program using that kind of fluid, improvisational, less hierarchical, lightweight institution that would allow people to like add things in the way that they want to add them, recycle the parts from an information good to do something else. I mean, this is a question that's very live right now as we go into the WTO patent suspension that has been requested by countries in the global south for vaccine production. Like, what if you could take the underlying science that was mostly publicly funded anyway and adapt it for local production? mRNA vaccines turn out to be like super easy to make. They require less than 0.1% of the space and less than 3% of the budget of a traditional vaccine factory. I just read a great paper in the American Institute of Chemists journal where they described how if you had a traditional vaccine factory and you converted a closet in that factory to make mRNA vaccines, that the closet's vaccine doses would outnumber the doses being produced by everything else in the factory. And so this idea that you can like devolve production to the edges and let people like make adaptations, it's again, like if you're Marx, you love it because like the workers own the means of production. If you're Hayek, you love it because control isn't being centralized. You have distributed intelligence being collected and aggregated, right? All of this is compliant with everything except for like this kind of paternalistic cronyism. And once you abolish paternalistic cronyism, you would probably get a different kind of culture, right? You get a different kind of way of relating to one another. You get lots of different ways of relating to each other. And that's what you see a lot of in Walkaway is these different social institutions and familial institutions that arise that are driven by a different set of external parameters for like how you need to be able to operate in order to interface with the rest of the world.
Yeah, and you take down the wealthy elites in the book. Obviously, is part of the joy of the book, and also just I remember it just came to my mind. I think there's a moment when gamification becomes unraveled in the process of looking at things, and what I love about that approach, like some writers try to create these monolithic visions of the future. You actually were assembling them and disassembling them in the same work. You were, how about this? No, that didn't work. And I think that's much more the way, if I look out into the future, that's much more the way that we are going to evolve our culture, society, mass collaboration networks is by trying things, having them fail and having another go at it. We spend so much of our time right now, though, dealing with broken systems that we don't have as much times to do a Wikipedia or a Linux project. We're now if I look at the last year, like people keep saying, oh, we have an epidemic of fear. I'm like, no, we don't have an epidemic of fear. We have an epidemic of outrage. Like people keep pressing the outrage button over and over, and it's wasting so much human ingenuity and time. How do we get out of what we've built that's weighing us down to be, more free? And I could walk away as a great, even if it's a metaphorical walk away, there's something that's needed there to let go of that which does not work.
Well, I turned in 3 books last month. One's a nonfiction book about labor markets and the arts, and then 2 of them are novels. And one I'd mentioned earlier, the mystery novel Red Team Blues, but the other one is called The Lost Cause. And it's a utopian novel about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias after a Green New Deal. Wow. And the protagonists in this book, the kind of cohort that this book celebrates and explores, are people who are born in this decade and who come into adulthood with the Green New Deal, and who call themselves the first generation in a century that doesn't fear the future. And it's aspirational, right? They do quite fear the future because they know that it's scary. But what they are able to do is it's not that they don't fear the future. It's that when they contemplate the future and they contemplate the bad things that they know are going to happen, right? Like, we can do a lot to remediate climate change, but we've sunk a lot of thermal energy into the ocean. We're not going to repeal the second law of thermodynamics. We're going to see substantial ice cap melting. Like, it's just going to happen, right? Like, because like I'm a science fiction writer, not a fantasy writer. Second law of thermodynamics is not a good idea. It's a law, and so they know that they're going to lose their cities. But unlike now, where we're probably going to lose our cities, right? But like it's just going to be a disaster. It's going to be one disaster after another, after another, after another. They're like, oh no, we're going to lose our cities, so we're going to plan for that. And it's like the difference between knowing that you're going to get cancer and knowing that you're going to get cancer and that there's a treatment for it, right? And that treatment might involve horrific surgeries and terrible, the terrible burden of chemotherapy. It still might shorten your life, but it's not this sense that you're just a passenger on a bus that's hurtling towards a cliff and the driver won't turn the wheel, right? And that, I think, like, if we spent a year being scared or outraged or whatever you want to call it, I think a large part of it has been driven by that. It's been driven by the sense that, like, we know that there's bad stuff coming, and there are people who have it in their power to address that bad stuff, not to make it go away, but to account for it. And they can see the cliff coming and they won't turn the wheel. And that, I think, is the thing that has made so many of us scared and angry. And that's the difference in attitude that the characters in The Lost Cause have, is when they're scared and angry, they know what to do with it. They know what lever to pull to avert or soften the thing that they're scared and angry about.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. When we have the capacity to take action, even if our action is not perfectly imagined or perfectly aligned, then we move forward. And looking back into some of your work, there's that feeling like people trying things. And, I hope we don't have to wait till a whole nother generation born now to get into the game of being able to try things and prototype things, even crazy things. I mean, we actually, we need an explosion of attempts, and we need the capacity to have, things like patent law get out of the way and things like government give space for human beings to try things. Obviously, those who follow behind and try to tidy things up are not the ones that are going to create the new world. It's the ones that are willing to get messy and willing to.
I don't know about that. I think as someone who's been in network ops since it was called being a sysadmin, I have a lot of respect for people who work on the boring infrastructure.
Yeah,
that's some pretty important, unglamorous work.
Unglamorous work.
And yeah, you can build the most amazing skyscraper, but if the ground crumbles beneath it because no one's been figuring out how to shore up the foundations, it doesn't matter how great your skyscraper was.
So we better have our technocrats involved in all the aspects of this as well, our dreamers and our technocrats, but doers basically. I think there's however we invent our way out of these things, it's going to require the action and people to have the impetus to take those actions. And
to the point, I don't think doer is a rare thing. I think there's a lot of potential doers out there. I think that, like, empowering people to reconfigure the tools and circumstances that they find themselves in is the bias towards action we should have, right? That, like, the problem with the rigid paternalistic top-down model of technological design and deployment isn't that it works well, but it's that it fails badly. I know more about my circumstances in the moment than you ever will. And so you can design a system with a bunch of intelligent defaults, but if I can't override those defaults, then there's going to be a moment of great mischief. And this comes up a lot in things like behavioral security, right? So information security as it intersects with human behavior, where you will have a thing like a hospital that'll say, it's against the rules to plug these machines into the network, right? These sensitive pieces of diagnostic equipment into the network. But then you get like a radiologist who's like, if I can't update the firmware on this thing, then I can't image this guy's tumor and save his life. And it's life or death. I got to do it in the next hour. And they're going to go and get the firmware on a USB stick and walk into the room and download it onto the device. And so if you don't give them a managed way to handle the exception, if you have an abstinence only education process for people who need to adapt their technology to their needs, that it's going to work as well as any other abstinence only system, right? It's just you're going to end up with a lot of unwanted outcomes.
Yeah. So The Lost Cause, and what was the mystery book, the name of that one?
Called Red Team Blues.
First of all, congratulations for having a good year.
I work when I'm anxious.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm the same. The shit hits the fan and I get to work. Whatever is right in front of me to get working on, I love that impulse. So when do you anticipate those books coming out?
That is a good question. So my career has been lucky enough that every book does sort of better than the last one. And so I don't sell books in advance because, like, generally speaking, the longer I wait to sell a book, the better my negotiating position is. So my editor has both of those books now. And we're trying to, I had not intended to write the mystery novel. The Lost Cause was in a schedule and I turned it in on schedule. Came in right on time. But I wrote Red Team Blues in 6 weeks flat while writing The Lost Cause. And so now we have 2 books and they're both super timely. We have to figure out a production schedule for them, like a publication schedule. So neither are contracted for. And one of the reasons neither of them is contracted for is we haven't figured out a production order for them. And so all of that's just got to get figured out. But and everything is messed up because of COVID. But with luck, we'll have some answers soon. And, it'll be in Publishers Weekly when it is.
Yeah, and certainly with Lost Cause, want to have you back on the show and have a longer conversation about that. That certainly is right down our alleyway as far as looking at, what does it take to create a world that works for all? Buckminster Fuller's quote, like how do we not do that? Because it's kind of an undoable thing, but how do we point people in that direction? As that's an important value for us to be working towards. Cory, totally appreciate the conversation. And also just think for myself and for the listeners, there's lots of little Easter eggs in that conversation of people that Cory mentioned, books. Please go back, review that. We'll get the transcript of this out so that people can go do some of their own source research. It's important to be educated in this time and educating ourselves, especially when it comes to areas of our life that we care about, what's important to us and what we want to have happen. I think I'm inspired by your reflection of culture as much as you as a writer, and you seem to be at the leading edge is such a bad term, but at the chaotic edge of where things are emergent, and I think your works have helped to create a lens to understand that in a bit different way. And of course, fiction gives us an ability to have an as-lived experience of something versus a piece of nonfiction or an essay, which gives us the facts and the ideas. So thank you so much for your work. And although you may not know yourself as this, we totally see you as a generative futurist and somebody who's helping us to generate a better future for humanity.
Thank you.
Great. So we'll be seeing you when your next book comes out and having a bigger conversation about that. Until then, good luck with everything, Cory.
The Boldly Now Show, igniting the world of burning desire, big ideas, and bold action.
Boldly Now is an initiative of the Generative Futures Initiative, generating a thriving future for humanity.